The Vanishing Map, June 21st, 2023, Elgin, Illinois. I've always had a fascination with maps. Not the glossy GPS-dominated kind, but the ones with stories etched into their faded corners, the ones that whisper secrets of places long gone. That's why I didn't hesitate when the Elgin Historical Society reached out, asking me to digitize a recently unearthed map of the town from the late 1800s. It's fragile, they warned. Handle it with care. They didn't tell me it was something else entirely. The map arrived rolled inside a weathered leather tube, the kind that seemed more at home in a treasure hunter's satchel than in a dusty archive. The moment I unrolled it on my desk, I knew this wasn't just any old piece of cartography. The paper felt oddly cool under my fingertips, and the ink, though faded, still shimmered faintly in the light, as if refusing to be forgotten. It was breathtaking in its precision. Streets I knew by heart were sketched out in impossibly fine detail. But it was what wasn't familiar that caught my eye, annotations written in cramped, uneven handwriting along the edges, a triangle near the river, labeled the meeting point, a series of dotted lines that zigzagged through the town like a forgotten railway, and in the lower right corner, a name scrawled in spidery ink, E.S. Finch. Curiosity got the better of me, as it always does. Pulling up satellite imagery on my computer, I began cross-referencing the map with modern Elgin. At first it aligned perfectly, but then came the discrepancies. Streets appeared on the map that didn't exist today. Alleys where there should have been houses, and one road in particular, Fincher's Lane, ran straight through what's now an empty industrial lot. The name tugged at me. Finch? Fincher. Coincidence? I zoomed in closer on the lot, but Google Maps showed nothing more than cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. Still, the idea of a road erased from existence, it didn't sit right. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the annotations near Fincher's Lane seemed to shift as I stared at it, the ink lines subtly bending as if alive. I blinked hard, but it didn't stop. That night, I told myself I'd leave it alone. I didn't. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments. The next morning, I woke up, with the map still spread out on my desk, mocking me with its impossibilities. Sleep had come in fits, my dreams tangled with shifting lines and cryptic symbols. Fincher's Lane lingered in my mind like a splinter, its absence from modern maps gnawing at me. I had to know if it ever existed, or if I was losing my grip on reality. I started with the town archives, sifting through digitized records over coffee. Property deeds, old city plans, even forgotten census data. But Fincher's Lane was nowhere to be found. Not a mention, not a trace. It was as if the road had been plucked out of time, leaving behind nothing but the name scribbled on an old piece of paper. By noon, frustration had set in. I opened Google Maps again, staring at the industrial lot where Fincher's Lane should have been. Nothing but cracked concrete and patches of weeds. But as I scanned the aerial view, something caught my eye. A faint outline, barely visible, like a scar on the earth. It was narrow and crooked, cutting through the lot in the exact path the map had shown. I drove there without hesitation, my pulse quickening as I parked near the lot's edge. The place was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. Chain-link fencing wrapped around the property, but it was easy enough to slip through a gap someone else had made. Standing there, I could almost feel the weight of the map in my hands. The faint outline I'd seen from above was clearer now, a path worn into the concrete. I crouched down, running my fingers over the jagged cracks, and that's when I noticed it. Embedded in the ground was something metallic, a rusted plaque, its edges eaten away by time. I brushed away the dirt and grime until I could make out the faintest impression of letters. Fincher's Lane. My stomach tightened. There it was. Proof that the road wasn't just a figment of some cartographer's imagination. But why had it disappeared? And why did the map insist on showing it, as though daring me to follow where it led? I stood there, the plaque still warm in my hands, and knew I wasn't done. I told myself I was being reckless, but that didn't stop me from returning to the lot after sunset. Logic had no place in what I'd found earlier. An erased road marked only by a fading map and a rusted plaque. And yet, the pull to see more was irresistible. The drive was unnervingly quiet, my headlights cutting through the summer haze. I tried to shake the unease pooling in my chest by turning on the radio, but every station crackled with static, an annoying hiss that only added to the tension. Finally, I gave up and drove in silence. When I reached the lot, something had changed. The overgrown weeds and graffiti-covered walls were still there, but now, nestled between two crumbling warehouses, was a narrow, winding path. A street. It hadn't been there earlier. My foot hovered over the brake as I stared at the road, its surface uneven and cracked, as if pulled from some forgotten era. A battered street sign stood at the entrance, its letters barely legible under my headlights. Fincher's Lane. I hesitated, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. It wasn't possible. Roads don't just appear. And yet there it was, as real as the car I was sitting in. My instincts screamed to turn around, to leave this madness behind. But curiosity is a powerful thing. I inched forward, the tires crunching against the broken asphalt. The air grew heavier with each yard, thick and almost syrupy, pressing against my chest. The further I drove, the darker it became, my headlights swallowed by an unnatural gloom. Halfway down the lane, the car sputtered. Then the engine cut out entirely, leaving me stranded in the suffocating quiet. My hands trembled as I tried the ignition again. Nothing. I checked my phone for signal. No bars. I stepped out, my breath visible in the strangely cold air. The silence was overwhelming, the kind that wasn't just the absence of sound, but an active suppression of it. I glanced back, but the road behind me was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Ahead, the faint glow of a building's window beckoned me forward. Against all reason, I started walking. Fincher's Lane wanted me here, and I had no choice but to see why. The glow in the distance was faint but steady, spilling through a broken window of what looked like an old brick building. As I walked, the air seemed to thicken, each step harder than the last, as though the path itself resisted my presence. My breath came in shallow gasps, the cold gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The building loomed larger with every step, its facade covered in ivy that seemed almost alive, curling and twisting as I drew closer. I could hear the faint creak of metal in the wind, but there was no wind, just silence, dense and unnatural. The door was ajar, hanging on rusted hinges. I hesitated at the threshold, my flashlight cutting a pale beam through the dust-filled air inside. The place reeked of mildew and something faintly metallic, like old blood. The interior was a labyrinth of decay, splintered wood, sagging beams, and peeling wallpaper stained with watermarks that seemed to form abstract patterns. But it was the walls that froze me in place. They were covered with maps. Some were pinned neatly, others sloppily tacked, or even stapled. Most were hand-drawn, their edges torn and frayed, the ink faded, but eerily familiar. My pulse quickened as I recognized the distinct style, the same delicate, deliberate lines as the map I'd been working on. And then I saw it. Pinned dead center on the largest wall was a replica of my map. The same streets, The same annotations, the same strange, shifting ink. But this one had something mine didn't. A thin red line, snaking through the town, ending at a circle labeled "You're Here." My hands shook as I approached it, the map impossibly pristine compared to the others. It was then that I noticed the knife pinning it to the wall. Old and rusted, the blade curved unnaturally, its hilt wrapped in worn leather. I reached out instinctively, my fingers brushing the map's surface. The ink rippled beneath my touch, like water disturbed by a stone. I yanked my hand back, my heart hammering in my chest. On the table beneath the map was a single sheet of paper. Fresh ink gleamed in the dim light, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Keep going." I didn't want to, but something deep inside told me I had no choice. I shouldn't have stayed. Every part of me screamed to turn back, to leave the map and the cryptic message behind. But I couldn't. The air inside the building felt charged, like the static hum before a lightning strike. My hands trembled as I clutched the flashlight, the weak beam flickering against walls that seemed to lean closer with every step. I followed a faint trail, footprints in the dust, too fresh to belong to anyone from the past century. They led me deeper into the building, down a hallway that narrowed unnaturally, the plaster walls cracked and oozing a dark, resin-like substance. At the end of the corridor I found the door. It was heavy, made of dark wood reinforced with iron bars, as though it had been built to keep something in or out. The handle was cold to the touch, and when I twisted it, the door didn't budge. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the air, and saw an engraving just below the lock. "What you seek is beyond." A sound broke the silence behind me, faint, like the creak of a floorboard. I spun around, flashlight trembling, but the hallway was empty. Still the air felt alive, charged with an unseen presence. Desperation took over. I scanned the room for something, anything, that could open the door. My eyes landed on the knife from the map room. Against every shred of rationality, I raced back, grabbed it, and returned. The blade fit the engraving perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment. With a groan, the door swung open, revealing a room that shouldn't have existed. It was larger than the dimensions of the building could allow. The walls lined with shelves that buckled under the weight of objects, jars of cloudy liquid, broken compasses, frayed ropes, and bundles of papers tied with yellowed string. At the center was a table, and on it lay a brass compass, its glass face cracked, but its needle spinning wildly. Surrounding it were small artifacts, so I recognized from the annotations on the map. A tarnished key, a folded ribbon, a coin stamped with an unfamiliar crest. I reached for the compass, and the moment my fingers brushed it, the needle stopped spinning. It pointed east, toward something beyond the walls of this place, something waiting for me. The door behind me slammed shut. I bolted to the door, yanking at the iron handle, but it wouldn't budge. The air in the room grew oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I turned back to the table, my breath shallow and quick, the compass still pointing east, its needle unwavering. That was when I noticed it. The map pinned to the far wall. It was different now. The once clear lines and markings were fading, dissolving into the paper as though being erased by an invisible hand. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crossed the room, watching helplessly as entire streets disappeared, leaving behind only blank space. "Stop," I whispered, the absurdity of begging a map lost on me in the moment. But it didn't stop. By the time I reached it, all that was left was a single mark, a small red dot, pulsing faintly in the corner. "You are here." And then it vanished. I staggered back, my head spinning. This wasn't just a map. It was alive, responding to something I didn't understand. I dug into my pocket and pulled out my phone, fumbling to capture what was left. The screen blinked on, but when I aimed it at the map, all I saw was the wall behind it. The map didn't appear at all. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. A notification. It was an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "The path awaits." With trembling fingers, I opened it. There was no text, only an attachment labeled Fincher's Lane, updated, PDF. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The map opened on my screen, but it wasn't the same one I'd been working on. This version was wrong. The streets I knew were gone, replaced by twisting paths and unfamiliar landmarks. And yet, in the center of it all, one word stood out in bold, jagged letters. Daniel. My name. Before I could process it, my phone shut off, the screen going black. I stood there, paralyzed, the room feeling smaller with every passing second. Somehow I knew this wasn't over. The map wasn't finished with me. It wanted me to follow, to step deeper into whatever it was unraveling. The compass in my hand hummed softly, its needle unwavering. East, always east. I woke up behind the wheel of my car, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. For a moment I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there, or even where I was. The night sky pressed down heavily, the world around me eerily quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of my car's hazard lights. The dashboard clock blinked 4:23 a.m., but something felt off. My phone was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. I fumbled for my watch, but it wasn't on my wrist. That's when I noticed my hands, scraped and filthy, as if I'd been crawling on the ground. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting against my skin. My surroundings were unfamiliar. A desolate parking lot flanked by decaying buildings, their windows shattered and lifeless. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. The last thing I remembered was the locked room and the compass pointing east. But now, here I was, miles away from Fincher's Lane, with no memory of how I'd gotten here. I checked my car for anything that might explain the gap in time. A receipt, a note, anything. But all I found was a folded piece of paper on the passenger seat. My blood ran cold as I opened it. It was a page from the map, torn neatly at the edges. Only this time the ink wasn't faded or shifting. It was bold, precise, and hauntingly clear. A single word was written in the center. Continue. Below it was a crude drawing of a building, a church, its bell tower leaning slightly to one side. I recognized it immediately. St. Magnus Chapel, an abandoned ruin on the outskirts of town. I'd driven past it before, never giving it a second thought. Now, it seemed to call to me. The compass, still in my pocket, began to vibrate faintly, its needle spinning wildly before settling east once again. I glanced back at the torn map, my chest tight with dread. The paper felt alive, pulsing faintly against my fingers as if urging me forward. Somewhere deep inside, I knew I was being led, manipulated by forces I couldn't comprehend. And yet, the pull was irresistible. I got back in the car and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and without another thought, I headed east, toward the chapel. The chapel stood at the edge of the forest, its crumbling silhouette barely visible against the pale light of the rising sun. St. Magnus Chapel, forgotten by the living, seemed to breathe with the weight of the past. The leaning bell tower loomed like a crooked finger, pointing towards something unseen. I parked the car on the overgrown path leading to its entrance, every nerve in my body screaming to turn back. But I didn't. I couldn't. The map, the compass, the strange trail of breadcrumbs. It had all led here. The wooden door creaked open with a reluctant groan, revealing the hollowed interior. Pews lay scattered, their wood splintered and rotted. Vines snaked up the walls, curling around shattered stained glass that cast fractured light onto the floor. At the center of the chapel, beneath where the altar once stood, was a mirror. It was the only thing untouched by time, its silver surface flawless, its ornate frame glinting faintly as if freshly polished. Above it, etched into the stone wall, were the same words I'd seen on the locked door. "What you seek is beyond." The compass in my pocket began to hum, its vibrations growing stronger. When I pulled it out, the needle spun furiously before freezing, pointing directly at the mirror. I hesitated, my breath shallow as I approached. My reflection stared back, pale and shaken, but as I drew closer, it began to change. The features weren't mine anymore. The face in the mirror was older, gaunt, and unfamiliar. It was the face of a man from another time, a man who could have drawn the map. And then he spoke. "You've come far?" The voice echoed, low and rasping, but his lips didn't move. Finish what I could not. Before I could respond, the surface of the mirror rippled like water, and the compass in my hand grew hot, searing my palm. I dropped it, but the needle spun wildly once more before stopping, pointing down. At my feet, the stone floor cracked, revealing a small hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal. I opened it, and my heart sank. The pages were filled with meticulous sketches, maps of places I'd never seen but somehow recognized. The final page bore a single line. "To complete the map, you must take your place." The mirror's surface shimmered, drawing me closer. Against every instinct, I stepped through. The world dissolved around me, and I became part of the map. Forever. I don't know how much time has passed since I stepped through the mirror. Days. Years. Time doesn't move the same here. It bends, twists, and loops like the lines on a map. I exist in a place between moments, caught in the ink that once fascinated me. The map is alive. I can feel its pulse, its hunger. It whispers constantly, urging me to draw, to chart the places it demands. My hands move without my consent, sketching roads that shift and vanish, landmarks that never stay the same. Every line I draw feels like a tether, binding me deeper to this strange, unending task. At first I thought I could resist, but the map does not tolerate defiance. It punishes with silence, an unbearable void that presses against my mind until I relent. When I obey, the whispers grow softer, almost comforting. I've learned its secrets, the ones that shouldn't exist. The map doesn't just chart places, it creates them. The roads, the alleys, the forgotten paths, they spring to life the moment my pen touches the paper. I've seen them take shape in a world I can no longer reach. Fincher's Lane was one of mine. I realize that now. It didn't exist until I drew it. Or perhaps it always did, waiting for me to bring it back. But the most unsettling revelation came when I tried to sketch my escape. The compass led me to a blank space, a void on the map with no markings, no annotations. It demanded that I fill it. But when I tried, the ink bled into nothingness, swallowing my lines. That's when I saw it, my name, scrawled in the corner of the map. Daniel Reeves, cartographer. It was there all along, etched into the fabric of this world, as if I had always belonged to it. I wonder if someone will find my map one day, rolled up in a forgotten attic, or tucked inside a dusty archive. Will they feel the same pull I did? Will they trace their finger along its shifting lines and fall into its grip? If they do, I'll be here, waiting in the margins, just as the last cartographer waited for me. The map never ends. It only expands, and it always needs someone to draw it. Like and subscribe for more videos. Tell me where you're from in the comments.